I was marking spelling quizzes with a red pen when my whole world tilted sideways. It was a gray Wednesday in late October, the kind of afternoon where the room smelled like dry erase ink and the cinnamon candle my co-teacher kept burning on her desk. 22 six-year-olds sat scattered at their tables, hunched over handwriting sheets. I was perched cross-legged on the carpet, a pile of papers balanced on my knees, when my phone buzzed inside my sweater pocket. An unfamiliar number flashed across the screen. I almost let it ring out, but something nudged me to pick up anyway. A man's voice, steady and deliberate, asked if I was Hazel Adeline Whitmore. I confirmed it was me, even though nobody had used my full name since my grandmother used it half-jokingly to scold me. He identified himself as a lawyer. He said there had been a crash on the highway just past Millfield. He said my grandparents, Walter and Eleanor Whitmore, had not survived. I remember fixing my eyes on a paper butterfly one of my students had taped to my desk leg. I stared at it for what felt like an eternity. Everything after that blurs together. Before I go further, you need to know what kind of family raised me. Truly understand it, because to anyone looking in from outside, we seemed picture perfect. I was raised in a wealthy suburb outside Nashville. My parents, Gregory and Vivian, were people obsessed with appearances. My father brokered commercial properties and drove a vehicle that broadcast his success before he ever stepped out. My mother headed the neighborhood beautification board, threw charity luncheons, and made certain our holiday lights went up before any neighbors. I have an older brother, Tobias, 2 years my senior, the son my parents had always dreamed of. Tall, self-assured, fluent in making my father laugh. He was swinging golf clubs by 12 and knew exactly how to command a room. I was the quiet one. I loved books, thunderstorms, and tending things that grew. I asked questions about the wrong subjects and too few about the right ones, at least by my mother's measure. At family dinners, I faded into the wallpaper. The only place I ever fully relaxed was my grandparents' farmhouse in the hills near Millfield. Walter and Eleanor had built a hauling and shipping company, Whitmore Transport, from absolutely nothing. My grandfather started with a single borrowed rig and one route, sleeping in truck stops to avoid paying for motels. He'd finished school at 12 years old and possessed more honesty than anyone I've ever known. Their home was modest and slightly lopsided, smelling of coffee grounds and wood smoke. My grandmother grew tomatoes along the back fence. My grandfather kept a workshop where he'd hand me tools and explain what each one did. My father found them embarrassing. He referred to their neighborhood as the Sticks, though it wasn't anything of the sort. At holidays, he'd slip in sharp little jabs about their pickup truck or my grandmother's coupon stack. He never said it outright, but the implication was obvious. These people were lesser. Never mind that they'd financed the house we lived in. Never mind that they'd handed my father the down payment for his first big deal without a second thought. Never mind that whenever his business faltered, Walter and Eleanor quietly bailed him out. They never once complained about any of it to me. I spent every summer there. My grandmother showed me how to make biscuits from nothing but flour and butter, how to sew a clean hem, how to hold someone's gaze when they spoke to you. My grandfather taught me that a handshake deal with an honest person outweighed any signed contract. He taught me that the hardest workers are usually the ones nobody bothers to notice, and a real leader notices them first. When I announced I wanted to teach, my mother set down her fork with that slow, composed motion she used when restraining herself. "Hazel," she said, "you have better options." My father simply said, "We won't be funding that." And they didn't. My grandparents did, without a moment's hesitation. My grandmother mailed me a card the week my program started. In her looping handwriting, she wrote, "We couldn't be prouder. The world needs more people willing to show up for children. You're going to be remarkable." I carried that card in my wallet for years. I still have it. I became a first-grade teacher at a public school in a small Tennessee town. My apartment was cramped. My car had rust creeping along the wheel wells. I survived on cheap pasta, and I loved every bit of it. My students became my whole world. On the hardest days, I'd remember what my grandfather told me. Do your work like it matters, because it does. My parents called now and then, usually to brag about Tobias's latest achievement or remind me to dress appropriately for a cousin's wedding. They never once asked about my classroom. They never asked about my kids. Every single Sunday for 9 years, I made the drive to see my grandparents, missing only when illness kept me home. Their funeral mirrored everything wrong with the rest of my family: polished, theatrical, and empty. My mother wore a wide-brimmed hat. My father delivered a eulogy that read more like a resume than a remembrance. Tobias stood in the receiving line, performing grief he hadn't earned. Distant relatives I hadn't seen in a decade filled the pews, whispering about what wonderful people Walter and Eleanor had been, which might have meant something if any of them had visited in the last 10 years. I stood at the back and cried, and not one person noticed. 2 weeks later, we gathered at the office of an attorney named Marcus Reyes on the 4th floor of a downtown building overlooking the river. Everything about the space felt hushed and expensive. My father settled into his chair like he'd already redecorated the room in his head. My mother sat with her hands folded, nails painted deep burgundy. Tobias, who'd driven 2 hours to be there, kept glancing at the door as if something more important might walk through it. Marcus worked through the standard legal language. I barely absorbed any of it, fixated instead on a framed photograph on the wall. River fog at sunrise, just trying to hold myself together. Then Marcus said it. The full estate, including all shares of Whitmore Transport, the property at 1187 Hollow Creek Lane, and all liquid and investment holdings valued at roughly $31 million, passes to a single beneficiary. The room seemed to tilt. Hazel Adeline Whitmore is the sole heir. What followed was the loudest silence I've ever experienced. My father's expression cycled through disbelief, confusion, and fury in the span of seconds. "Say that again," he demanded, voice clipped and controlled. Marcus didn't repeat himself. He simply slid the document across the desk. My mother's composure shattered first. "This has to be a joke," she snapped, with no warmth whatsoever. She was over there every single Sunday, filling their heads with, "They anticipated this reaction," Marcus interrupted calmly, turning his laptop to face us. "They left a recorded message." And there they were on the screen, and my grandparents, sitting on the same faded floral couch I'd sat on 1,000 times. My grandfather's hand rested over my grandmother's. They looked older than I remembered, but their eyes were bright, focused, completely present. My grandfather spoke first. "Well, if you're watching this, we've passed on, and I hope we didn't leave you too big a mess to clean up." My grandmother chimed in. "I picked the outfits, so at least the caskets look decent," and elbowed him playfully. Even from beyond, they made me laugh through tears. "We made this decision with clear minds and full hearts," my grandmother continued, looking straight into the camera. "We spent a long time thinking about what legacy really means, and we realized it isn't about money. It's about values. It's about what you leave behind and who carries it forward." My grandfather cleared his throat. "Gregory, Vivian, we love you. You're our children. But love and trust aren't the same thing, and we learned that the hard way over the years. We watched how you treated this family, this money, and the people who couldn't do anything for you in return. We saw you." My grandmother looked directly at the lens, and we saw Hazel. She showed up every Sunday for 9 years. She sat with us. She never once asked for a thing. She laughed at your grandfather's awful jokes, helped me in the garden, called just to talk. She's the one who's kept this family's heart beating. So she'll be the one who keeps what we built. The screen faded to black. I won't recount everything that happened in that room afterward, except to say it was neither short nor quiet. My father said things I won't repeat. My mother sobbed in a way that had nothing to do with loss. Tobias stared at me with a contempt so raw it was almost refreshing in its honesty. That evening they summoned me to my parents' house. I went, some small part of me still hoping for reconciliation. There wasn't any to be found. My father had documents prepared, a transfer of administrative control. They would manage the estate. I'd get a generous allocation, his exact phrase, of 15%. You teach first grade, my mother said, like it was a medical diagnosis. You can't run a company worth millions. This is the sensible choice, Hazel. We're protecting you. I looked down at the papers on the coffee table. I thought of my grandmother's voice on that screen. She's the one who's kept this family's heart beating. No, I said. They escalated fast. Tobias slammed a cabinet door. My father told me that if I left without signing, I was finished. No holidays, no calls, no family. Dead to them. I left anyway. Within the hour, I discovered my father owned the building I lived in, through a shell company, Brightwater Holdings, that I'd never known existed. A text arrived. A formal eviction effective midnight. I packed what mattered most: clothes, books, the letters my grandparents had written me over the years, the quilt my grandmother had hand-stitched when I left for college, pieced together from scraps of her old dresses, my grandfather's worn flannel shirts, and a square cut from my childhood Halloween costume. As I carried out my last box, my father stood on the sidewalk and told me I'd been an accident, that they'd been happier before I existed, that I'd done nothing but complicate his life. I got in my car and drove toward Millfield. Marcus Reyes was waiting on my grandparents' porch the next morning with 2 coffees and a bag of pastries from the local bakery. He'd called all night. When I didn't pick up, he said he figured I'd gone exactly where I belonged. We sat at the kitchen table, and he laid out what my grandparents had spent 4 years quietly assembling. One folder, then another. My grandmother's journals cataloging every loan my father had taken and never paid back. Every snide comment he'd made about them behind closed doors. Every time my aunt cried poverty while posting beach vacation photos online. Records of a $250,000 loan to my father, co-signed by my grandfather 5 years earlier, never repaid, and hidden from his own business partners. Then Marcus opened his laptop and showed me security camera footage. 2 days after the funeral, my parents had let themselves into the house with a spare key. My mother walked straight to the hallway bookshelf, slid open a hidden panel, and pulled out a small fireproof box. Inside were my grandmother's pearl earrings, her ruby brooch worn every Christmas, and a gold locket that had belonged to my great-grandmother. My father stood by the window, arms folded. My grandparents had installed those cameras specifically because they'd feared exactly this. They'd thought of everything. Medical evaluations confirming full mental competency, signed within 6 months of their deaths, plus sworn statements from their pastor, their physician, and a neighbor of 3 decades. They'd built a fortress, and then handed me the key. In the days that followed, the people my grandparents trusted began arriving. Marlene, my grandmother's closest friend of 40 years, brought a second journal and enough casseroles to feed half the county. Hector, who'd run my grandfather's repair garage for over 2 decades, recalled overhearing my father on the phone calling my grandfather a tightwad just waiting to die. Owen, my grandfather's longtime business partner, spread financial records across the table with barely restrained fury. And Judge Patricia Calloway, who'd grown up down the road, showed up in a tailored blazer and said simply, "Walter called in every favor I owed him. I intend to repay it." When my parents and brother arrived the next morning expecting to find me isolated and small, they instead found a kitchen full of people, a retired judge, a former deputy sheriff turned neighbor, a business partner with damning paperwork laid out in precise rows. My father tried his usual act, pointing at me and calling me manipulative, calling the whole scene a circus. Marcus let him finish, then turned on the laptop. They watched themselves on the security footage. My mother went rigid. Owen set the loan documents down on the coffee table. The silence that followed was the kind that settles when everyone in the room understands the fight is already over. I looked at my father. For the first time, not as the looming authority I'd spent 30 years trying to win over, but as a frightened, grasping man who'd never once questioned who he'd become. "You didn't come here to protect me," I told him. "You came because you were scared I'd become someone you couldn't control. You spent my entire life making me feel like I wasn't enough. But the 2 people who knew me best, who watched all of us for 50 years, chose me anyway. That has to mean something, even if you never admit it." He had nothing to say. My mother cried in a way that, for once, seemed genuine. They left, and the door shut behind them. The room let out a breath. The months after were full. Marcus walked me through the legal process with patience and care. Owen taught me the freight business from the bottom up, not so I could run daily operations, since he handled that better than anyone, but because my grandfather always believed a leader who didn't understand the work couldn't truly respect the people doing it. I learned what it cost a driver to be away from home for a week straight. I learned why my grandfather always kept coffee brewing and his office door open. Buried in the files, I found something my grandparents had spent 2 years quietly building, the foundation of a charitable fund. Their plan was simple and unglamorous: scholarships for first-generation college students in rural East Tennessee, school supply funding for under-resourced classrooms, and a dedicated grant for after-school arts programs. I funneled $8 million into it within the first year. I kept teaching. I want that to be absolutely clear. I still walked into my classroom every morning to 22 first graders, learning to read, learning to share, learning that school could be a place where someone was genuinely happy to see them. The money changed what I was capable of doing for them. It never changed why I was there. When a student's shoes wore through at the toes, I could fix that. When a child showed real talent for music but her family couldn't afford lessons, we made it happen. That money was never mine to hoard. It was mine to put into motion. I live in my grandparents' farmhouse now. It still smells like wood smoke and coffee. The tomato plants still return every summer. My grandfather's tools still hang in size order in his workshop, and I haven't touched a single one. Every Sunday, my kitchen table fills up. Marlene, Hector, Owen and his wife Marcus, who's become something like an honorary uncle, fellow teachers, neighbors, a loud, messy, wonderfully imperfect group of people who loved the same two souls I loved and who kept showing up for one another long after they were gone. Nothing about these dinners resembles the ones from my childhood. No one performs. No one keeps score. We talk over each other, laugh at jokes that aren't even that funny, argue about football, and eat until we can't move. This is what my grandparents really left behind. Not $31 million. They left proof that a life built on integrity compounds over time. Every honest deal my grandfather made, every worker he treated with respect, every neighbor he helped without being asked, it all came back. Not to him. He never needed it to. It came back to me, in the form of a room full of people who loved him enough to stand up and say so when it actually cost them something. They taught me that real wealth isn't what you stockpile. It's what you build inside other people. It's a classroom that never runs out of supplies. It's a kid from a small town who makes it to college because someone she never met decided she was worth betting on. It's Sunday dinners where nobody has to earn their place at the table. If you've ever felt like a ghost in your own family, if you know what it's like to grow up surrounded by people who treated you like an afterthought, hear this. The people who truly see you exist somewhere out there, and sometimes they're not who you'd expect. Sometimes they're the ones everyone else overlooks, and sometimes the people who are supposed to love you reveal exactly who they are. And the bravest thing you can do is believe them. Stop auditioning for people who already made up their minds about you. Go find the people who show up on Sundays,